Hi, welcome to the second session for Post Trade. We're going to be looking at innovation as the basis for branding and marketing in modern life and modern business, and this can all be applied to the post sector. In fact, I think it's really useful that it is applied to the post sector. I'm going to look at this quote from Peter Drucker. He talks about the purpose of business being to create a customer, and the business enterprise has two and only two basic functions: marketing and innovation. These are what produce results, and everything else is a cost. Marketing is the distinguishing, unique function of the business. Now, Peter Drucker is a marketing guru, so he would say that. But what does that mean for post? If we're looking at companies differentiating themselves, branding and marketing themselves without substance, and that does happen, essentially it's a kind of a way of positioning a product or service that isn't based on any tangible USP, unique selling point, or anything, any set of brand values that are concretely realised. We're subject to that all of the time. If you walk into a supermarket aisle and go and buy washing powder, ultimately you've got a really wide range of different products available to you: tablet forms, powder forms, liquid forms, two-in-ones, basic ranges, premium ranges, powders that get whiter, powders that are sensitive to woolens, powders that retain colours. It's quite an overwhelming array of choice. The basic point is washing powder or liquid, they get your clothes clean. So everything above and beyond that is a kind of a tweak, and some of it has a basis in its chemical composition and lots of it doesn't. So essentially those companies, those products are being differentiated on less rational values for the brand. If Fairy puts a picture of a baby on their products, then families think that that's a kind of, a wholesome product. It understands the needs of a family. It's going to be kind to babies, and that's not based on any kind of a empirical, measurable truth, but it is one way of differentiating. I'm not saying all of these washing powders and brands don't have any tangible product, but certainly a large number of them won't have. So they're differentiating without any level of innovation, and that works for general level consumer products. A lot of the time it works. People can tap into our emotions and sell to us that way. Within the creative economies and within a more specialised set of products and services that you find in post, marketing and differentiating without basis, without substance, isn't going to work so well, if at all. So this is why we started with a quote about innovation from Peter Drucker, because really this is going to be the key to understanding how the post sector sustainably markets and brands itself in modern times. Innovation is the basis for differentiation. I like this little illustration that talks about how markets are entered and products are launched. I'll leave it there for a little bit for you to see it. It's just for humour value, really. And that's a fairly dry classification of terms, which you can also choose to pause. I'm not going to go through it now, but it's just there as reference. I suppose the innovation definition is something that I would like people to think about a little bit more, because it has been used in different ways. So this isn't the answer. It's just one idea about what innovation is. For my purpose, I'm going to go with the innovation definition from Christian Claytonson, who is out of Harvard Business School, and he's written extensively on innovation. He talks about it as an embodiment of a useful idea in the marketplace. He says it's not scientific, it's not mysterious, it's not a kind of R&D lab where people are having eureka moments and inventing things and patenting things. It's not about working prototypes which don't really have a value in the market. He very much sees it in material terms, and it's ultimately the idea, the abstract idea, realised within a market and having value within a market for Christian, and I would tend to go with that because that's the way we've understood innovation. It's a very applied thing. It's something that a company like Google has a lot of cachet in, and Google actually have a systematize innovation. There's a famous 20% deal with Google. They see that their employees can all contribute to innovation, so they give at least some of their employees, if not all, and actually it's not all, they give them 20% work time to work on their own projects because they've recognised that that feeds into an overall culture of innovation which has benefits for them. So lots of companies have been looking at innovation for a long time in order to understand and analyse it and create the conditions that lead to more innovations by more of their staff. So it's not a mysterious thing. So in terms of organisations, goals of innovation are things like improving the quality of the product or service, creating new markets, extending the range, reducing costs, whether that's labour, improving the production processes, reducing material costs sometimes, reducing environmental damage. The list goes on. This is not comprehensive, and often companies will be focused on the first few of these because that's how companies tend to operate. We don't tend to set ourselves huge goals unless we're a big organisation that has public profile and reputation is really important to us, and we are very visible, and therefore we may need to address, for example, our energy consumption. And actually that is increasingly a big draw for employees, maybe not so much consumers, but for employees looking to go into companies, going into a company that you feel is environmentally friendly, for example, is increasingly a big deal. But that only really happens if the company's recruiting lots of people and that company has other competitors that really good potential employees could go to. So there's lots of others, and you could have a think about how to break this down into a bit more detail if you choose. Okay, most innovation does fail. So it is an investment cost between about 50 to 70%. This is a statistic, always question statistics, but I put the source in there in case you want to get into more detail with that. And by fail, we mean fails to impact on the organisational goals that it's been set up to deliver on. So it doesn't always mean failure as an absolute term, but there are implications for that. Obviously there's a lot of resource because lots of time and effort go into trying to innovate things. There's a loss of morale sometimes, which I think everybody would understand, and if there were a series of failures, then there would be resistance to future innovation because people would start to believe that it was unlikely that they would succeed. So there is a cost to failed innovation. I'm giving you a really interesting picture now of linear systems. So a linear system is where the output is directly proportionate to the input. Innovation is not linear, so that's why a curve like this would be more appropriate. For example, output's not directly proportional to the input, so you could have a process like the one outlined here, where we go from discovery to profit, but we don't know each of these steps, which one is going to suck more time and resource, which one's going to be more time inefficient. Maybe there will be certain sections of the process that will just take longer. Maybe some will be very quick and we'll get feedback, and it sometimes reach a point of critical mass at some point along this line, and you start to see some serious returns on investment if the innovation's successful. Bearing in mind most are not. So there is always this portion up front where you're not getting much back considering the amount of investment, so it's a cost to a company. The reason lovely Audrey is on this slide is that lots of systems are non-linear, and if we think about certain career paths, certainly acting is one example, definitely not linear. Lots of upfront investment, very little return on that, people working long hours for free, bad conditions, and eventually if you're in the lucky top few percent of people in that profession, you make a huge return on investment, but it is obviously not equally distributed over the course of your career. So that's an example of a non-linear system. Innovation can start in any one of these three areas. Again, it's not a comprehensive list, but it's a nice way to simplify and make sense of how companies can start to initiate differentiating behaviours, differentiating products, differentiating services. Generally speaking, they're going to happen in one or maybe two or possibly even three of these areas, but there are lots of components within each of these areas. So reducing the amount of things that companies try to innovate on reduces the risk and reduces the investment costs. So let's start with how these things impact each other. There's lots of components in each area, and those components interact with components in other areas. We'll get into some detail. I'm going to give you a practical illustration of what I mean by this. And people often start in the grey circle, technology, when they're trying to innovate something, but technology has a lot of uncertainty attached to it because of things like, software updates, cross-system compatibility, obsolete operating systems or environments, or conflicts for one reason or another. Technology is changing so rapidly, people don't know where it's headed. And technology is more and more a driver of the way that business is done and the way, frankly, that life is lived. But people don't know where it's going. There's lots of people contributing to new technologies. They all have investment in making their technology the technology of choice. They don't always have investment in making their products compatible. And there are business models in place that make us buy things in a particular way around technology. And I'm not just talking about built-in obsolescence. I will give you a case study a bit later on that illustrates that point. So technology may not be the most sensible option, counterintuitively. Components in all of the areas change, and they change quickly. So in an ideal team, in a business, and you'll find this if you go into any post house, there's a bunch of people in there. Some of them are techies, some of them are kind of experts in the field of post-production, but you will have people in there that are good with business development or client management, or CEOs that have a background in financial accounting, because those things are really integral to the success of a business. And those actually could be the things driving the business forward and making it sustainable, and that could be the point of differentiation, actually, even though on the ground, where as the service is delivered, it seems like it's all about post and it's all about technology, it's all about client experience. It may not be. Okay, when you think about technology, by the way, a useful kind of side note here is just to say that you need to think about the technology not only that the company's using, but technologies that are related to the technologies the companies use, or technologies used by competitors, because all of those things impact. I am going to give you a material example just to get some of this kind of tangible, because it can be a bit abstract, I think. Arterial is a contemporary art rental service that I have got some seed funding for and I'm trying to develop. It's working on a subscription-based business model. So people pay a low monthly fee and they have artwork coming into their homes on a rotational basis, and they don't have to buy it, but they can. And the artwork gets out of dormant storage, it stops taking up space in artist studios, and it gets exposure, it gets into circulation. So it's, from my mind, it's a win-win, but there are lots of things that I need to think about. Technology is one of those things. So when I was brainstorming this, and I would encourage you, if you're looking at a particular post house or facilities house, or I don't know, some other player within the post sector, that you just brainstorm this, throw down as many things as you can on paper, just in order to get the juices flowing and get your ideas out on paper, and not to filter or censor yourself as you go. Put it all down, and then you can filter at a later stage. So everything that relates to the technology for this contemporary art rental service, I've put on there, from display requirements to how it would be hung, to what the user interface would be online, to what the packaging is that I would use. These are all technologies that I would need to think about, maybe. The more components in this circle, and any of the three circles that you consider, or a company considers, when it's trying to innovate and differentiate itself, the higher the risk. So it's basically trying to bite off more of the apple. There's more to chew on, so there's more investment. And if it works, great, but we've seen that most innovations don't work, so it's a big risk. And there's much more research that is needed kind of in the preliminary stages in order to make sure that risk is well managed and calculated as being a sensible level of risk, if that's not an oxymoron. Okay, market, next circle. Lots of different people and organisations might use the innovation of product or service. Market, you also want to think about the benefits to users when they're that maybe they would expect from it or not expect to it. So buyer's surplus is in there because buyer's surplus is essentially everything above and beyond the need being met. So if I don't know, if I go down to the chip shop and buy a bag of chips, I've had my need met. If I get edible chips and it fills the hole in my stomach, that's the kind of base level. And then on top of that, if I were to get a loyalty card stamp, or if I were to get free mayonnaise, or I don't know, it's not a great example probably, but there's things people can do to add value, and that is called buyer's surplus, and that is how to get your market invested in what you do. And it is something that people think about. They're not just directly meeting a need and nothing before that. And we're seeing that more and more now, is that buyer's surplus is a big deal. So that's also something to think about in terms of the market, because there'll be an expectation in some ways that you do get free mayonnaise and you do get a loyalty card, and those things on top of the direct need, but buyers are increasingly demanding, I think. So companies have to be increasingly aware of that in order to compete. Okay. The market also will change its behaviour potentially as they benefit from using it. We've seen examples of that with the way people consume newspapers and any kind of publishing related media. So everybody's now changing their behaviour. There's all kinds of subscriptions that you can get. You can have ebooks lent to you from your library, from Kindle. You can subscribe to Kindle's library now. So there are lots of different ways in which people's behaviour, we used to just buy or get loaned books and read them like that, one at a time, or maybe enthusiasts would carry a couple around, but now we're getting through material in a very different way. So innovations can really change behaviour. The profit that markets are willing to render to the business selling the innovation, people in luxury goods don't mind spending a lot of money, and they know that a large amount of that is profit. So that's all about aspirational lifestyles and branding and brand values. Think of that whatever you may. It's just an example of how people's idea about what the reasonable level of profit is that they'll give is, and that's all about perception and the experience, and those profit margins differ wildly across different products and services. So and there may be new or old market applications involved in innovation. It might not be that it's all really new. It might have components that are really established. I can't think of an example offhand without going into a different sector, so I won't. All right, arterials markets, when I was looking at that, I just wanted to simplify it and break it down into domestic and commercial markets. And this, again, was not an exhaustive list. It's just me focusing. I did the brainstorming, and then I thought, right, okay, these are my potentially core market groups, and I'm not going to deal with 6 at one go. I will concentrate on either domestic or commercial, and within that probably 1 or 2 at most, because different markets have very different demands. The research that you need to consider at this stage would be, thinking about the research that you need to undertake to understand the market, it's an ongoing quest for any company. If they get out of touch with user needs, demands, requirements, they're on a pathway to failure, in a real sense, not in a kind of did this innovation fail or not? Did we learn from it? No, if they don't meet the bottom line, they're going to fail. They're going to go under, and that happens to a lot of businesses if they don't stay in touch with the market. and the market changes increasingly so, and any digitally based business in the creative sector, particularly because the creative economies are generally quite small and they are responsive and they move and they're based around technology a lot of the time, especially if they're digital, obviously. That means that user needs are more rapidly prone to change than other sectors. So you might want to think about the conversations you need to have with industry. Definitely get yourselves to BVE. There are tons of really good panels. Conversations with experts, people that you have exposure to through some of your freelance work or employed work, and just ask if if you're already doing work with the company, then you're in a good position to get a conversation. But keep in mind, Steve Jobs did say, if it's hard to design products by focus groups, a lot of times people don't know what they want until you show it to them. And this echoes, I think, Henry Ford's quote. He said, and Henry Ford obviously made the famous Model T car and was pioneering in the way that he systematized car production and brought costs down. But he said if I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. So the point is, people don't have that leap of imagination. Oftentimes, we don't know in advance how much a new product or service or technology could improve our lives or impact our lives. And yeah, people are quite slow to change. Perhaps, we don't want to admit that to ourselves, but we're actually quite slow to adopt new ways of behaving and new technologies. And you, being younger, should be more flexible, but I don't know, something weird happens with age and you do become less flexible. I'm open to suggestions on how to keep flexible because I don't want that to happen, but it does seem to happen. You definitely develop more rigid preferences for how you do things, and I don't know, you're turning into your parents without even wanting to. So back to the script. Market application. Think about why people would use the product or service that you're unpacking in your article. And think about why they would use it, where the demand is. Maybe it's localised to a very particular part of central London, Soho, for example. What's the competition? What's the level of competition? The size of the competitors? It might be that there's 20 other, local companies doing that, but they're all kind of small, so it's actually not much slack in the system. And think about whether it costs more to supply than you can charge. Obviously, it needs to be financially viable to enter into the market. You really need to know what your price point is and what people are willing to pay for things. Get that wrong and none of it works. Okay, so the market for arterial, again, I applied this lovely circle strategy where I thought about all the different people, all the different groups rather, that I could target, and just kind of thought about which areas would kind of tie into my values, because it's a social enterprise, so I'm not all about the luxury market, even though I know that would be strategically and financially the sensible move. It's not the thing that I'm interested in. So it's just a question of what your the company's strategic objectives are and how it ties in for them. But generally, companies are interested in money. I guess we all are, really, ultimately. But how many of these do you need to consider? Again, the same rule of thumb applies. The more components you want to innovate on, the higher the risk, the larger the investment, the more the uncertainty. So none of this is to be undertaken lightly. Market segment research, I did a bit. I went to the Arts Council, for example, and that's what got me this fun fashion and friends demographic. They've done tons of research and they've identified different demographics, of which this one seemed like the most likely fit for me. And that's on that basis, I got the seed funding. I do need to do a ton more research, but I have undertaken primary research, and some of the most useful research I've had is from people that weren't up for the subscription service at all. They gave me lots of reasons as to why they wouldn't be interested in the service, and that was really useful, actually. That was far more useful than people saying, oh yeah, I think it's brilliant, I think it's great. That's nice. You need that for motivation, and you need that ultimately to validate the idea and make it viable, but the people that weren't going to sign up were really, really helpful in terms of me refining the offering. And when you're thinking about market research as well, bear in mind Steve Jobs did say you've got to take everything that you hear in the context of it's not value free. Everybody that you talk to has a particular agenda, and they, you need to be able to some degree read their language so that you can interpret what they're saying. That's not a very clinical approach, but we're in a humanities degree, so it's fine. And the other thing I was going to say is, I'm not sure how relevant this is, but I'll say it anyway. When companies are developing websites or developing online marketing campaigns, they go to extreme lengths to create user personas. They might create 400 for a campaign, and those user personas are, they're really kind of hypothetical profiles of users down to age, where they live, what they do, ethnicity, educational background. They go into a lot of detail and they create these personas in order to test out their marketing campaigns. So they then, from those few hundred, they'll refine that down based on their marketing campaign and the success of their marketing campaigns. And they'll refine it down and they'll get a clear idea of who they're marketing to, and they'll concentrate on those key users as examples of their demographic. Obviously, they've got, if you're doing it online, you don't necessarily know who you're marketing to, but it's just that anecdote is just designed to illustrate how important the creation of the understanding really of your demographic is for companies. As I say, if you get out of touch with that, then you're on a path to ruin. Some questions to think about in terms of market segment are how many people, how do the segments compare, how important is price for each of those segments, because it could be really that you could have very different profit margins for different segments. How can segments change with innovations? Maybe one of your segments is bogged down in tons of regulation and they're not really very responsive. So it could be that innovation in, some form of implementation is not particularly beneficial for them. And where are your segments geographically, and what do people in each segment care about the most? They will have distinct needs and distinct priorities, so it's good to know what those are. Okay, implementation, that's basically everything between the technologies and the market, everything involved in getting the product or service to the people that use the product or service. So in reality, it would include things like production, distribution, how the industry is structured, what intellectual property looks like, how it's governed, what the weak spots are, what the common kind of obstacles are with IP, and that will be really relevant for you guys, I think, and what the business models are. Is it a boutique, high-end, very small, high-touch kind of client experience where there's a fewer clients that pay a bigger premium? Is it something where there's just, you're cranking out lots of jobs and you're outsourcing things to rendering farms in Asia? Different business models will apply at the implementation stage. And actually implementation is an area where lots of innovation happens. It might seem a bit, lacks the excitement of technology maybe, but it's a very practical and therefore feasible way of innovating and making yourself stand out. So implementation rather, can even bring old ways of doing things back into circulation. So I don't know, with this arterial idea, I'm going to be distributing physical artworks. So that's generally not the way that subscription business models operate. They operate digitally because there are no costs for distribution. So it makes sense because people that pay subscriptions want very low monthly outgoings and they don't want to pay lots of money. But if you physically distribute something, then you have to pay for that. So I'm actually trying to kind of push these two parts of the process together and make them work as a business model. And I'm not sure that it can be done actually, but I'm going to try because that is my vision. And I think sometimes things that don't seem like they're going to work are actually, it's just a question of persisting until people get it. But maybe I'm just completely off on my own there. Questions to consider in terms of implementation of how things are produced, what the cost is for each component. It could be that, certain things are outsourced because it's cheaper to outsource something. Everyone can work through cloud-based file sharing, so increasingly that's an option for people. So some parts of the process may make more sense to outsource, but it's good to know which parts those are and who's doing it, and if it's industry practice or whether it's just people are still experimenting with it. What companies produce various components? Is it that you have a service agreement with I don't know, a big manufacturer in industry? Does that then mean that you're tied into their products and services? Does that work? Is it better for integration and ensuring that there's a smooth workflow, or is it that you're going to outsource things to different companies because then they can compete a little bit more and you can get a really bespoke system? Does that cause any issues in the workflow? Those kinds of questions are things you could think about. What the business model is for your product or service, and questions to kind of generate some detail around that is whether the business is vertically integrated, and I'll talk about that in a moment. What aspects of the business are supplied, which aspects are assembled by others, which are all in-house, and is licensing a key requirement? Have they got a cloud-based software suite, for example, and is that something that plays a key role in the way that they do business? Depending on the compatibility of clients' software suites, for example, it may be different answers will impact different things like IP, like profit margins, revenue streams, branding, and reputation ultimately. Okay. Is there any regulation in the sector, or are there just a few big players that kind of lean on the smaller players and can coerce things because of that, can coerce regulation, can coerce the way that business is done, can actually make entry into the sector quite difficult, or it could just be the technology costs, the setup costs are really difficult, so that is the obstacle to entry. Have you considered different options for part of the product or service? So outsourcing some of it now, maybe, or maybe in the future. Maybe it's something that you're investigating as part of your potential innovation plan. Maybe we will outsource this product, or maybe we're looking to put everything in-house, vertical integration. So this is the lovely diagram for vertical integration. It's very sexy, I know, and you could work at one or two or more of those layers of implementation, so from making the thing to getting it to market. Some organisations will be just about branding. That's a creative agency. Some will be, if they've got a production house if say it's an ad agency, they might have their own production team, and they also do the branding. So then they're really working in a more vertically integrated way. There could be benefits to doing that. It might make for a smoother client experience. It might also be a risky strategy if there aren't many jobs coming in and you're having to pay out wages for the production team if they're not actually working on productions. If you're doing business development, where lots of employees can work on business development, but the production team clearly they work on production, so they're not going to be doing proactive production. So what kinds of contracts are they on? Are they on, maybe they pull in freelancers, maybe they have a kind of retainer, or how are people doing things and managing their workflow? Probably the companies you're looking at are pretty busy, so they're not having to think about these things, but it depends really on the company you're looking at. Changing the business model, generally speaking, it's an incremental innovation, and by that I mean it's small and it's regular, but it's not going to be doing anything wildly disruptive to the industry. So fundamental disruption is what people get excited about. It's where things are really interesting and they have big impact, and it changes the way that people consume, or it changes the way that things are delivered or how something's viewed. that doesn't happen half as much, or even, less than half as much as incremental innovation, where smaller things are changed. Incremental innovation, you can essentially think about those circles, and you could be innovating on like one area or two areas. That's incremental innovation. It doesn't really disrupt anything. But everyone gets excited about fundamental innovation. Business model and changing the business model, likely to be incremental. So I'm trying to get a subscription-based business model together with physical distribution of artwork. It's not going to rock anyone's world anytime soon. Nobody really gives it that much thought apart from me, and therefore I'm pretty sure that it is incremental. I'll leave that on there. It's a little bit dry again. It just talks about how quickly things can be realised, and incremental innovation. It's helpful if you want to achieve a win in a shorter period of time, but that's probably obvious. So I did say that I'd mention how slow people are to adopt technology. It's partly because human beings are resistant to change, and as I said, increasingly with age, and it's partly because companies make more money by releasing things less frequently. So Intel, for example, they have a really simple system where they have 3 processors, a premium, a kind of mid-range version, and a basic version, and they have those in circulation, and every 3 years, I think it is, or I could be getting the years mixed up with the amount of processors they have. I'm sure a quick Google will give you this information if you're really interested, but I think it's every 3 years they essentially, each of those processors drop down one in the hierarchy. The basic range becomes obsolete, the mid-range level becomes basic, the premium level becomes mid-range, and they introduce a new premium model. So they do that in a very systematic way, and that means they sit on top of technologies for a long time. They're actually ready to go, but they can get more money by drip feeding us, and bearing in mind what we said, that people are not always keen to adopt technologies off the bat. So, and I mean that in a generalised sense. Obviously, some people are early adopters, but the majority of human beings will be pretty slow to the disruptive technology party. So we consume the way we consume. Intel get to make more money, and we don't have to change. So it is even though it seems a bit exploitative, it's serving the purpose for the consumer as well. And where really interesting and innovative technologies have been released too early to market, actually they've often failed. So we by just researching this a little bit, we see we're not as on the ball and forward thinking as we'd like to be. The reason Amazon are on there is because they're an example of incremental innovation, and I'll get to why that is in a moment. So this is the 70-20-10 asset model. Basically, that means most innovations for companies are in the safe area. 70% will be very safe innovations where there's not a high degree of uncertainty and risk. And progressively, with higher risk, they're going to be open to less and less activities that are risky and innovative. So mostly businesses do things safe, and I guess that makes sense pragmatically. I will leave this on for you. It's just another slide about how there is constant iteration. It's this process of kind of cycling through the way that these different parts of the innovation process, market, technology, and implementation relate to each other. And as the innovation becomes more refined, they become less and less distinct and more concentrated. So you might start off thinking, I'm going to do this, this, and this from marketing, I'm going to do this and this from technology, and I'm going to do this from implementation, but actually you'll find that your core offering just really leverages fewer of those areas, and those areas work more smoothly with each other over time. Okay, so I might just choose, for example, if I was looking at Arterial, I might just choose to think about innovating on these areas of the implementation circle. So thinking about geography of implementation, and maybe I can find that, and actually that is going to be one of the areas in which I'm going to innovate, as I'm not going to offer it to people outside of London and kind of northeast Kent, because that's where I'm based and that's where the artists that I'll be working with are based, and it's a physical distribution thing, so I've just got to be really pragmatic. And if I can make it work in a small area, I can scale it up. If I overstretch myself, I'm just not going to make any money, and I'll actually lose money. So I'm not keen to do that because I want it to work. So you can see that there are different parts of the implementation circle that I could concentrate on. We also want to think about how different parts of each circle interact with each other. So, sorry, you can't actually read some of that, but you get the picture. I could just think about, okay, the market I'm going to concentrate on is schools across Europe, and then I think about how that relates to different parts of the technologies and different parts of the implementation, and therefore I can refine my innovation, my plan for developing and differentiating what I do. It really impacts how I'm going to deliver, how I'm going to exist, how I'm going to market myself, and how sustainable I'll be. So this process that we've been talking about with innovation, it is generic. It can be applied to any industry. It's iterative, and risk is reduced through learning and through abstraction. So it's through giving you this generic process that you can then map onto other things, and hopefully, I know it's a lot of content for you to take in, and it might seem a bit abstract, but it's a way of you approaching something and unpicking it in order to understand how things fit together, and talk about it quite strategically, which is a good tool in your bag. Learning, innovation's innovation, but trade cuts through everything in business. It's all about whether something is valid for the user, whether there's any transactional value in something. And as soon as you get to the point where you can trade, you'll get feedback that is, it's the most valuable feedback, and the only real feedback if you're a business that wants to sustain itself. So all the feedback you've had in market research up until the point of transaction is, it's great, it's what you need in order to get that done, but the transactional feedback is the thing. I'm just going to skip over this a little bit more because it's about innovation and how you should try and really think about pricing up front, because different people will pay different things, and you've really got to understand your market. In the primary research I did with Arterial, I had one person saying they would pay £5 a month, at which point I said, this is not for you, this product, because I can't get it delivered. And one person said they would pay, the equivalent of a gym membership, maybe £40 a month. So there's vast differences, and you've really got to understand the market and know the market, and partly that will come through experience. So people generally set companies up once they've had some experience in the market themselves. Keep an eye on things, understand where things are moving, if that's even possible. Nobody really knows, but we have indications, and they may or may not come to fruition. It's difficult to know initially whether something is going to be successful or not. It's probably quite a contentious example there. There were technologies such as the X-ray. I mean, when the X-ray came out, nobody knew that it was effectively radiating your body and not very good for you. So all kinds, people that were experimenting and developing the X-ray were X-raying themselves constantly. So people don't know that when technologies come out, and that's why we have recalls on cars, and that's why people now with software development, they all adhere to agile software development, which is where you can release something really quickly and you're out there getting real feedback on it in order to refine and develop it. So most institutions, as I think I might have already bored you with, run about 3 software iterations behind the current update for software, because at least the first couple of updates will be quite buggy, and part of the business model is that they release them and then all the users act as a kind of focus group and give back lots of feedback, and that's how software gets made, because you don't really know. Things are increasingly complex, and interaction with technologies is increasingly complex, so it makes it hard to future-proof and predict things. So Amazon, back to Amazon. They started as a bookseller. At that point, they were selling online. Other companies were selling online too, but it wasn't really regular practice for people to buy things online. People were quite skeptical. They didn't know that it was safe to give their credit card details around. They didn't have things like PayPal, so they didn't have trust. They hadn't ever transacted online before, so there was a lot of resistance. Now we take it for granted that it's the way that we buy things, but it wasn't at that point, at the point that Amazon entered the market. So people were doing it, but it wasn't common. It wasn't common practice. It wasn't the dominant form of transactions. So what they were doing wasn't innovative at all. Actually, I mean, they were selling books. Books definitely weren't innovative. They were trading online. That definitely wasn't innovative. But they looked at the long term. They worked with very thin profit margins in order to gain lots and lots of users. So they were concentrating on a long-term vision. And it was through building that customer base, that was the longer term implementation innovation that they achieved. Because once they have that customer base, once they know that they can leverage suppliers with that customer base, if you've got access to a ton of suppliers through Amazon, you'll bring your profit margins down because you're trading in volume, and therefore you make your costs back. So it all becomes about economies of scale. And those incremental innovations, Amazon could realise them faster. So nothing they did was particularly innovative, but now you can see they've gone into all kinds of products and services. So Amazon tackled implementation, and they've got lots of people there that aren't just about selling books. They had techies, they had people, clearly in business development. They had people, they must have had some really good accounting staff, but obviously now what they do, they've got such a wide range of products and services. They've got, as with a company like Apple, as with many companies, they're trying to get a user to have, all more of their products and services Amazon based. They've also, disrupted publishing as a business model. So now anybody can publish an ebook and put it for sale through Amazon. It used to be that wasn't possible. You'd have to go via a publisher. There were fewer publishing houses. It was very competitive. You'd really need to be at a certain level of notoriety and a certain level of quality before you could have any hope of getting your work out to the general public. But through Amazon, we've now got a completely different publishing model where those things are possible. So they have now, from their incremental innovations, they've continued to innovate and capitalise on their large user base. And with market share being in their court, they can set the rules pretty much. So they've been pretty disruptive. Out of these Apple products, which do you think is the most innovative? Well, I don't know what your answer was, but it's actually the fella on the far left. It's the iPod. And the early iPod was really innovative. And these are the reasons why. The iPod changed implementation. It partnered with people who made music, and the music business model was changing at that time. There was, Napster was making people consume, not making people, was enabling people to consume and share music in a completely different way. It was really altering the revenue streams for the music business, and they didn't know how to handle Napster at all, but they did, try to make some efforts to get on board with where technology was taking people, aside from the fact that they also resisted file sharing and couldn't adapt to that change and couldn't understand their users' needs, actually. So lots of companies in the music industry went under, lots of the bigger companies were amalgamated, but that's an aside. Apple saw an opportunity and it partnered with people and it provided music and it integrated itself with an online store. People could buy single tracks. It was, something that people weren't used to doing through an application online through Apple. And they also, they made devices, and Apple made iTunes available for all devices. So it was a really, really fundamental innovation through this iPod that you could, attach to your computer and buy things online. You could suddenly have a very different user experience in terms of the way that you consumed music. So that was seriously innovative. The iPhone, not so much. We might think of it and tend to think about all of the things it can do, but that doesn't mean that it's particularly innovative. Actually, phones had been around for a long time. It's a very tough market, very competitive. Apple did try and partner with AT&T, but ultimately their innovation wasn't radical. It was still a very targeted market application, and the tech innovations that we think of when we think of the iPhone, like touchscreen and voice recognition, neither of those were new. They weren't invented for the iPhone. They were just released in the right product at the right time, so when people were ready for it. So overall, it was far more incremental than the iPod. There was same price mechanism, same industry partners. Still going to get your phone service through, I don't know, EE or O2 or Vodafone, whoever. So none of that was revolutionary. There were lots of competitors doing similar things, if not completely the same. So when we talked about the iterative interaction of market and technology and implementation and how that gets refined over time, it's useful to think about this, because the iPod was refined over time to the point where it doesn't appear particularly disruptive. The iPhone, because of the way it appears with lots of apps and kind of lots of functionality, we have this impression that it's innovative, but it's really about thinking more strategically about how those processes have evolved and what's involved in those processes as well. Okay, iPad's probably obviously not the most innovative. It's using technologies that were all there. iOS software was already there. It was sold to people that were already using computers, so the market was in existence. So it's actually, strangely, Apple have gone from the most to the least innovative product, and I don't know how anybody feels about that. So I hope that this session was useful to you guys. Do review it. I've run through it quite quickly in order that you have it as a recording, and if there are any questions, get in touch. See you next time.